Now, I've seen in earlier videos how aggregate demand is made up of various components, but what we also need to be able to do is we need to be able to analyse the concept diagrammatically, and the first element of that is to be able to draw the aggregate demand curve. And the aggregate demand curve is going to be showing us the relationship between the price level in the economy, the general price level, and the amount of real output, or real GDP it might be called. So the way we draw this is similar to our other economic diagram. So we've got the price level on the vertical axis and real output on the horizontal axis. It's important to have price level up here rather than just price, because that indicates that we're talking about macroeconomics here, and we're talking about the general price level within an economy rather than for a particular good. And the aggregate demand curve is a relatively simple downward sloping line like this. Okay, and what this is telling us is quite simply that as the price level in the economy changes, that will have an impact on the amount of real output that is taking place. So, for instance, if we saw an increase in the price level from P1 to P2, that would mean that there would be a reduction in the amount of real output from Y1 to Y2. Just a quick word on the annotations here. Price level we normally annotate with P, and real output we normally annotate with Y. Y, as you may have come across already from microeconomics, means income. Generally in economic terminology. So what we're talking about here, real output, is essentially another way of saying the overall amount of income which is earned within the economy. So Y1 was the total amount of income earned previously, and Y2 is the new amount of income which is earned after the price rise. Now, there are three reasons why this curve slopes downwards. These are a little bit advanced for this stage in the course, some of them. They will make more sense, hopefully, if you were to watch this video back again towards the end of your course. So I'm just going to go through them very briefly, so that we can make sure that we understand them all. So the first one of these ideas is what we can call the real income effect, or it's sometimes called the wealth effect as well. Now, this was an idea proposed by an economist called Pigou, and what essentially this is saying is, if we consider the diagram that we've got here, what we can see is that there is an increase in the general price level within the economy. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means that the income that households are earning is less able to buy goods. The money that they're earning has less purchasing power. What that means is that if the price level goes up, as we can see here, the likely outcome of that is that consumers are going to start to cut back on their level of spending. And as we know, C is one of the components of aggregate demand. So what this, in essence, is saying is that the increase in price leads to a reduction in real disposable income, which in turn leads to a reduction in C, which leads to a reduction in AD. So what we can see there is how the increase in P that we see over here ends up creating what we call a contraction in aggregate demand over here from Y1 to Y2. Now, the second one is slightly more complex than this, so we're going to whip through it quite fast. The second one is called the interest rate effect. It was proposed by an economist who I'm sure, if you haven't already heard of, you will do a great deal, which is John Maynard Keynes. And what this one says is that if price levels are rising, as we can see here, then what's likely to happen is that the households and firms are likely to require higher levels of currency in order to make their purchases, because the prices have gone up. That means that we are going to see an increased demand for loans, and the likely effect of that will be to increase the interest rate. Now, as we will see in a lot more detail later on in the course, if we increase the interest rate, that is going to reduce the C and I components of aggregate demand, which will mean that we see the contraction from Y1 to Y2. So the chain here goes that the increase in price leads to an increased demand for funds, so that households and firms can make the purchases they want. That leads to an increase in the interest rate, and that leads to a reduction in C and a reduction in I, which leads to an overall reduction in AD, as we can see from Y1 to Y2. And the third one, I'm just going to move this over there slightly so I've got a little bit more room to play with here. And the third one then is what we call the exchange rate effect. And this was a couple of guys actually. This was Mundell and Fleming that proposed this idea, and this one considers what the impact of this increase in prices will be on a country's international competitiveness. And what this one says is that if the price level in one economy rises, then that's going to reduce the demand for our exports. Because our price levels have gone up, our products will be seen as more expensive by people overseas, and as a result of that, they're likely to buy less of them, and therefore X will go down. And as we know, X is one of the components of aggregate demand, so if we get a reduction in the value of X, we will also get a contraction in aggregate demand. So just add on there that leads to the reduction. So what we can see here then is that we end up in each case with the increase in price at the start through a different chain of analysis each time, but ending up in the same place, which is the fact that the increase in the price level leads to a contraction in the level of aggregate demand, a movement along the aggregate demand curve. And of course, all of those effects will work in reverse if the price level was falling. So if we saw a reduction in the price level effect, then through the real income effect, the interest rate effect, and the exchange rate effect, we would see an increase in the level of aggregate demand within the economy. We would see an extension, a movement down and to the right along the AD curve.